In this lesson, we will be reviewing Autodesk Inventor's sketch constraints in a 2D environment. These sketch constraints are used to help define the shape of our geometry and also go back and help hold design intent. So there are two ways to get to these sketch constraints. So from the 2D sketch panel, we can scroll on down, and the default here is going to be the perpendicular. That will be the top level entry by default. But the tool that you select last will pop up to the front, so yours may be different than perpendicular, so that's the first way to get it. Or you can right mouse click, and from the menu here we can click on Create Constraint, and we'll also have the exact same options. So let's just walk through these. So the very first one is going to be perpendicular. So pretty straightforward. Select two lines, and the lines that you select will become perpendicular or 90 degrees. The next one is parallel. Again, we're going to select two lines, and in this case, those lines will now be parallel. The next one is tangent. So if I select a line and an arc, they will become tangent. I could also select two arcs. So anything that you select, those two objects will become tangent to each other. I'm going to undo that for a second. Let's take a look at the next one here. And that's going to be smooth. And what smooth is going to allow us to do is actually go back and select a spline and another either another spline or an arc segment or another line, and it will be a constant smoothness in between the given segments here. We'll talk about that later in another lesson. The next one is a coincident constraint, and a coincident constraint is going to be that 2 points touch. So let me hit escape here, and I'm going to erase out that arc segment. And I'm going to replace it with another line. So for example, if I go back and select on that other endpoint, you'll see that it goes green. That's actually applying a coincident constraint. But I'm going to fall a little bit short of that. Just hit the escape key. Now there's a couple different ways of applying that coincident constraint. The easiest way is just drag that endpoint to the existing endpoint. And you'll notice now in this case I can't drag it because it's locked down to that 0, 0 point. Or if I undo that, let's create manually the coincident constraint. Select the 2 points, and they are now joined together. They don't necessarily have to be points. I can go back and just draw in a let's draw a line segment inside here. And if I apply a coincident constraint between that endpoint and that line segment, so now as I drag up that line, if one moves, the other one moves, so it definitely has a relationship set there. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete out that line segment. And let's take a look at the next constraint, and it's going to be concentric. So in this case, I'm going to draw in an arc, or I'm sorry, a circle. And if I go back here and reselect the concentric option, selecting on the arc and the circle, the order does not matter. They will be concentric to one another. Of course, in this case, when I was drawing that, I simply could have selected the center point of that arc for the center point of my circle. Or the other option to do that, let's say I do have a circle that's already drawn here. I can just press the escape key and just simply drag the two center points together. So those would now be concentric, or in this case it's a coincident constraint. In this case, the exact same result. So the next option is collinear. So let's going to pan this over. I'm just going to draw in a few lines here. So what collinear is going to allow me to do is select two line segments. And with the collinear option, with those two line segments, if you were to snap a chalk line, both of those lines would fall on that exact same chalk line. So in this case now, if I drag one of those up, the other one goes with it because they would fall on that same line segment. Let's pan this back over to my other set of geometry. And I'm just going to hit escape because I already had some objects selected. That's why my options did not show up. So create constraint. So the next one is equal, and the shortcut key is the equal key. So in this case, if I go back and select two lines, they are now the exact same length. If I were to draw in a couple other circles here, and I'll make them small enough so we have three different sizes. So from the keyboard, I'm just going to press the equal key. Selecting my two circles, they become the exact same size, and I'll do the same for the third circle. So now, as I make one larger, they all move. If I apply a dimension to one of them, all three are the exact same size. So in this case, let's go ahead and erase out those circles. And let's take a look at our next constraint. So horizontal and vertical. So we'll do both of these together. So horizontal, vertical, pretty straightforward. So first of all, horizontal, I can go back and just select on a line segment. And of course, it'll become horizontal. If I would do the same thing for vertical, the line that I select will become vertical, exactly what you would expect. Let's undo that though, because there are a couple other options available with that horizontal and vertical constraint. Let's go back in this case, select it from the panel bar. So with horizontal, I can also go back and pick points. So I can say, well, I want that endpoint to be lined up with the midpoint of that other line. Or I could say that I want that endpoint and that endpoint lined up with one another. So now if this geometry happens to change its size, you can see exactly what's happening. Those lines are aligned or in this case aligned horizontally. Now the same thing applies with the vertical constraint. So if I select 2 points, those points in this case are now aligned vertically. So the fix constraint, I can go back and you can fix a point, and by fixing that, it cannot move. So if I hit the escape key and try to drag that point out, it will not allow me to do that. I'm going to undo that. And if I apply that fix constraint to the line segment itself, I can stretch out that line and make it longer or shorter, but you'll notice I cannot move it up or down, just its size will change. So with the fixed constraint, we don't have to apply too many of them. Specifically, we have our center point origin automatically projected. We're going to basically use that to lock down that geometry. And the last constraint that we have is going to be the symmetry constraint. So let's quickly pan this over. And let's draw in a couple pieces of geometry for us to take a look at. So I'm going to draw in 2 line segments that I want to be symmetric about another line. In this case, I'll also go back and probably make that a center line here. So by making that a center line, now let's go back and apply our symmetric constraint. Select the first line, that's going to be symmetric, to the second line, to the line of symmetry. In this case, it's going to be the center line. And we'll go back and we'll do the exact same thing for these opposite two lines. Now, while I'm still in that tool, I no longer had to select the center line since it already realized that it was. So now if I stretch this out, you'll see that the angles are exactly the same. Of course, in this case, the size is not, so I can maybe apply an equal constraint to give the size on both lines exactly the same. So the symmetric constraint is allowing me to go back and define the angle for each of those line segments. One last point to make in regards to applying sketch constraints. So after I'm applying these constraints, it's also removing the number of dimensions that are going to be required to fully constrain the sketch. So in the geometry that I have up on the screen here, you'll notice that it shows that I have 5. So let's go back, and I'm going to apply a perpendicular constraint between the bottom and the right side line. You'll notice now I am down to 4. So every constraint that I'm going to apply will start to reduce that number. And again, our goal is always to get that fully constrained. That way we can predict exactly what's going to happen. So right now I'm down to 3. And in this case, let's also go back and let's apply a tangent constraint between the arc and that bottom line. I'm now down to 2. I can apply 2 dimensions just to show you, and dimensioning, you will learn how to do this in an upcoming lesson. So let's make that 20, and let's make that 25 units high. You'll also notice that it's fully constrained. The sketch turned completely dark with my color scheme as shown here, and down at the bottom of the screen it shows me also as well fully constrained.